There are places in every city that the rest of the city prefers not to see. Not because they are hidden. They appear on maps. They have street names, traffic lights, and thousands of people moving through them every single day. But over time, quietly and without any formal announcement, the rest of the city simply learns to look past them. In Los Angeles, most people know it simply as Skid Row. 50 city blocks in the heart of downtown. Between 8,000 and 11,000 people living a precarious existence at the margins of society. If you have never been there, picture this. Block after block of tents and cardboard shelters packed so tightly against each other that walking through the corridor means brushing shoulders with someone every few steps. The smell of diesel and concrete, and something harder to name. People sleeping in doorways at noon. Conversations happening in the middle of the sidewalk that nobody around them seems to notice. A city inside a city, and one that the city surrounding it has spent a very long time pretending is not there. But Skid Row did not begin that way. In 1876, Los Angeles became the last stop of the Transcontinental Railroad. Transients, seasonal workers, and displaced Civil War veterans began pouring into the city, especially near the railroad stop. The single-resident hotels and boarding houses that served those railroad workers, all young, single-adult males, were the founding institutions of the neighborhood that would become Skid Row. As Los Angeles expanded and wealthier neighborhoods pushed outward, those buildings stayed behind. The cheap rooms remained. And over the following decades, the people with nowhere else to go found their way there. By the 1970s, thousands of people were living within those 50 blocks. Veterans, people battling addiction, people with untreated mental illness, people who had lost every layer of stability they ever had, one layer at a time, until there was nothing left beneath them. And on the morning of October 23rd, 1978, a 50-year-old man named Jesse Martinez was found stabbed to death in an alleyway near 5th and Wall Streets. He was not the last. 6 days after Jesse Martinez, October 29th, 1978, an alley in the 300 block of East 3rd Street. A 32-year-old man named Jose Cortez was found with multiple stab wounds. He had been sleeping in that alley, the kind of sleep that comes from complete exhaustion, the kind where the world could shift around you and you might not stir in time. The following morning, October 30th, a 46-year-old man named Bruce Emidrake was found on South Kohler Street. Stabbed, left where he fell. November 4th, a 65-year-old man named J.P. Henderson on a sidewalk in the 500 block of West 7th Street. November 9th, and this one is different from the others. This one had witnesses. David Martin Jones was 39 years old. He was attacked on a walkway outside the Central Library on West 5th Street. Not in a dark alley, not in a vacant lot, but in a place where people were nearby. 3 men standing close enough to see what was happening, close enough to hear the attacker speak. They told investigators that a soft-spoken, clean-shaven, heavy-set man had approached them and chatted with them for several minutes before turning on Jones. He moved with an unusual, slow gait. He told them his name was Luther. He said he was from Puerto Rico. Then he attacked David Jones in front of them and walked away. November 12th, Frank Reed and Augustine Luna, 2 men, one night, found in the same area. November 17th, Jimmy White Buffalo, a Native American man whose nickname became one of the only human details that survived in the public record of these killings. November 23rd, Thanksgiving Day, a man named Frank Garcia, 45 years old, notably not a transient, but a city custodian from East Los Angeles who happened to be near Skid Row that night, was found on a City Hall plaza bench directly across from the Parker Center Police Headquarters. The killer had left a palm print on that bench. 5 men dead in November alone. Bodies in alleys and parking lots and on the steps of public buildings within a 4-block radius of each other. And the streets of Skid Row carrying a new kind of fear through every shelter and doorway and makeshift sleeping arrangement in the corridor. December 1978. A public restroom in the Greyhound bus terminal in downtown Los Angeles. Someone had written something on the wall. Careful, deliberate, someone who had taken their time with it. It read, "My name is Luther. I kill winos. I put them out of their misery. Investigators who were called to photograph it recognized the name immediately. 3 witnesses had heard the attacker outside the Central Library call himself Luther. And now Luther had introduced himself in a bus terminal bathroom and dared the city to find him. The LAPD formed a task force. Detectives walked the corridor. They talked to residents. They collected what little physical evidence the scenes offered. A palm print on that Thanksgiving Day bench. The bathroom wall inscription. Witness descriptions that consistently described a heavy-set black man, around 6 feet tall, who moved with a slow, deliberate gait and spoke in a quiet, calm voice. On December 14, 1978, officers spotted a man standing over an intoxicated man sleeping on the sidewalk on Skid Row. They stopped him. They searched him. They found a double-edged, stainless steel, cork-handled knife. He was arrested for disturbing the peace and carrying a concealed weapon. He was held in the county jail. While he was in jail, the killing stopped completely. He was released 3 days before the final murder. On January 21, 1979, a 26-year-old man named Luis Alvarez was found stabbed to death at 415 Harlem Place. He was the 11th victim, and the killing stopped. For good. The corridor went quiet, and investigators, looking at the timeline, understood something with absolute certainty. The pause in December, the weeks the killings had stopped, lined up precisely with the period that man with a knife had been sitting in the county jail. They went back to his file. His name was Bobby Joe Maxwell. He was 29 years old, originally from Columbia, Tennessee, paroled from Fort Pillow Prison where he had served time for armed robbery. He had arrived in Los Angeles in 1977, where his 2 sisters lived, and had been drifting through the Skid Row area since. Unemployed, spending his days and nights in the same corridor where 11 men had now been found with stab wounds. Investigators pulled his known writings, letters and journals found at his South Los Angeles apartment. A handwriting expert compared them to the inscription on the Greyhound bus terminal wall. The expert concluded it was the same hand. A graphologist examined the cardboard scrap with the word Satan written on it that had been left beside one of the victims. Same conclusion. His diary contained a single entry that investigators read very carefully. Praise be to the Prince of Darkness. The palm print on the Thanksgiving Day bench at City Hall Plaza, the one left beside Frank Garcia's body, was matched to Bobby Joe Maxwell. He was arrested on April 4th, 1979, an old movie theater in downtown Los Angeles. He said immediately and without hesitation that he had not done it, that he was innocent, that every piece of evidence pointing at him had been misread or fabricated or circumstantially misunderstood. He would say the same thing for the next 40 years. The trial finally opened in late 1983, 4 years after his arrest, delayed by a legal dispute over publishing rights to a book about the killings. It ran for 9 months, the longest trial in Los Angeles County history at that point. The prosecution's central witness was a man named Sidney Storch, a 37-year-old former police officer with a significant criminal record who had shared a cell with Maxwell for 3 weeks. Storch testified that Maxwell had confessed to the killings and had admitted he forgot to wear gloves during one stabbing, which was how the palm print ended up on that bench. After 25 days of deliberation, the longest jury deliberation in Los Angeles County history, the jury convicted Maxwell of 2 counts of first-degree murder, Frank Garcia and David Jones. He was acquitted of 3 others, and the jury deadlocked on 5 more. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He went to prison saying he was innocent. 30 years passed. Inside the California prison system, Bobby Joe Maxwell filed appeal after appeal. He was never violent in custody. He maintained his innocence in every legal filing, every conversation, every interview request. The case against him had always rested on thin foundations: a palm print, a handwriting comparison, the testimony of Sidney Storch. Then the truth about Sidney Storch began to surface. Storch was at the center of a sprawling jailhouse informant scandal that had been quietly unraveling the Los Angeles County justice system for years. Investigation after investigation revealed that Storch had fabricated confessions from cellmates in exchange for lighter sentences. Not once, not twice, but repeatedly across multiple cases. He had been caught forging evidence. He had been charged with perjury. Among his many arrests was one for impersonating a CIA officer. In 2010, the Ninth United States Circuit Court of Appeals issued its ruling. In a 42-page decision, the court called Storch a habitual liar and found that jurors had never been told he had received a deal for early release from prison in exchange for his testimony. The conviction was overturned. Bobby Joe Maxwell was granted a new trial or release. He was in his 60s by then, gravely ill. Prosecutors looked at what remained of the case without Storch's testimony and found almost nothing they could bring to a courtroom. The physical evidence was 4 decades old. Storch had died in prison before he could face perjury charges. In August 2018, all remaining charges against Bobby Joe Maxwell were formally dropped. A court found him not guilty. He never heard it. In late 2017, Maxwell had suffered a severe heart attack and fallen into a coma from which he never recovered. He died in April 2019, still in that coma, still in the hospital, never regaining consciousness, never knowing his name had been cleared. Which leaves the most uncomfortable truth of this entire case sitting right where it has always been. If Bobby Joe Maxwell did not kill those 11 men, and the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals concluded that the case against him was built on lies, then the man who walked up to David Jones outside the Central Library on November 9, 1978, and said his name was Luther, and attacked him in front of 3 witnesses, and then walked away, that man was never identified. He was never arrested. Jesse Martinez, Jose Cortez, Bruce Emmett Drake, Yotbe Henderson, David Martin Jones, Frank Reed, Agustina Luna, Jimmy White Buffalo, Frank Garcia, Luis Alvarez. 11 men in 3 weeks. 4 blocks, a knife, and a name written on a bathroom wall. Luther was never found, and to this day, nobody knows who he was. This is Case 1 of the Dark Side of Skid Row. The man who called himself Luther vanished into the Los Angeles night in January 1979 and was never found. And while that case left the corridor of Skid Row shaken and uncertain, the city moved on the way cities always do. But the gap that made Luther possible never closed. The same 50 blocks, the same concentrated vulnerability, the same quiet understanding, embedded in the way the city organized its attention and its resources, that what happened on those streets required less urgency than what happened everywhere else. The mission stayed. The cheap hotels stayed. The thousands of people sleeping in doorways and alleys and makeshift shelters stayed. And the world outside those 50 blocks kept looking past all of it. In February 1987, a man walked out of a San Diego prison and drove straight to Los Angeles. He had served 2.5 years, reduced from what prosecutors had originally sought, for the assault and false imprisonment of 2 women. They had survived. The case had been complicated by the way cases involving victims in difficult circumstances often get complicated. He had pleaded down, done his time, and walked out of that facility on a February morning with nothing visible ahead of him except the road north. He drove to Los Angeles, specifically to South Los Angeles and the streets surrounding Skid Row, a corridor he had already spent time in before his San Diego arrest. He knew how those streets worked. He knew what the city paid attention to and what it had quietly decided it could afford to overlook. He had been studying that question in one city after another for 17 years. 5 months after walking out of that San Diego prison, a 41-year-old woman named Carol Alford was found in a South Central alley on the morning of July 13, 1987. She was lying face down on the concrete, naked from the waist down, wearing only one sock. There were drag marks in the dirt near her body. She had been killed somewhere else and moved there before sunrise. The autopsy confirmed manual strangulation, multiple bruises near her jawline and cheekbones, hemorrhages around both eyes, and beneath her fingernails, scratches she had left on the hand around her throat in the final moments of her life. Her daughter came to identify the body. Investigators collected DNA from Carol's clothing and from beneath her fingernails. They opened the case and worked it as hard as the available evidence allowed. And when the evidence ran out, the case went cold. The man who had killed Carol Alford was already back on those streets, moving, watching, completely invisible to the system that had just processed Carol's death and filed it away. He was born Samuel McDowell on June 7th, 1940, in Reynolds, Georgia. His mother, Bessie May, was a teenager when he arrived. He later told investigators she had abandoned him almost immediately, left him to be raised by his grandmother in Lorain, Ohio, moving between relatives and between cities throughout his childhood, never settling anywhere long enough for anything stable to take root. By the age of 16, he had already been convicted of breaking and entering in Omaha, Nebraska, and committed to a juvenile institution. He was reported for 47 disciplinary infractions in under 2 years, a number that tells you something about a 16-year-old that the system apparently decided not to look at too carefully. He trained as a boxer at the Mansfield Reformatory in Ohio. He was good at it. He competed in Florida in the 1960s under the nickname Mad Daddy, and by the time he reached adulthood, he was 6'3" and broad-shouldered with the kind of controlled physical power that comes from years of serious, disciplined conditioning. From the outside, in casual interactions, almost none of that registered. People who spent time around him described him as easy to talk to, personable, the kind of man who could make conversation without effort and put strangers at ease before they had time to think about whether they should be. His criminal record accumulated across more than a dozen states from the late 1950s onward: assault, theft, fraud, narcotics violations, more than 100 separate encounters with law enforcement across 11 states. To any individual police department seeing his name for a weekend, he looked like a familiar type, a low-level drifter cycling through the system before disappearing again. Nothing that made anyone look harder. What nobody saw across all those jurisdictions, across all those arrest records in all those different cities, was what had been quietly happening since approximately 1970. He had been killing women for 17 years before he arrived in Los Angeles. City by city, state by state, refining his approach with each year that passed without consequences. He chose women already living on the margins, women navigating addiction, women in street economies, women whose social connections had fractured enough that a sudden disappearance might not immediately generate a missing person report. He used his hands because manual strangulation left investigators almost nothing to work with. And he had watched across multiple cities in multiple years as deaths in communities like these got processed quickly and incorrectly, ruled overdoses, listed as undetermined, filed under natural causes, and closed without the scrutiny they deserved. He had built his entire operation around the certainty that it would keep happening. He was not wrong. 5 months after Carol Alford was found in that South Central alley, he was still on those streets. He had not left, had not gone quiet, had not changed anything about how he was moving through that part of Los Angeles. He drove his van along Figueroa Street and Central Avenue and through the blocks surrounding Skid Row, moving the way someone moves when they belong in a neighborhood, without urgency, without anything about them announcing what they are. He had money for drugs. He had a friendly face and an easy way of starting conversations. And he had 17 years of practice approaching women in exactly these kinds of environments, in exactly these kinds of circumstances, with exactly this kind of patience. August 14th, 1989. A 35-year-old woman named Audrey Nelson was found stuffed inside a dumpster behind a nightclub on East 7th Street in Los Angeles. She was naked from the waist down. She had been beaten repeatedly on the head before being strangled. Not quickly, not from a distance, but up close with bare hands with enough sustained force to shatter bone. The officers who processed the scene made a decision that was ahead of its time. They clipped Audrey's fingernails and collected the DNA from beneath them, 5 years before collecting nail scrapings became standard investigative procedure in a homicide case. Nobody in that parking lot behind that nightclub on that August morning understood how much that decision would eventually matter. September 3rd, 1989. A 46-year-old woman named Guadalupe Apodaca was found inside an abandoned auto repair garage in South Los Angeles. A young boy kicking a soccer ball against the side of the building had peered through a gap in the wall and seen something he should not have had to see. Guadalupe had been strangled, her hyoid bone, The small horseshoe-shaped structure at the base of the throat that fractures under the specific pressure of barehanded strangulation was completely shattered. 3 women, 3 separate crime scenes, 3 separate investigators working in 3 separate precincts with no mechanism to see what they were all looking at together. Carol Alford in July 1987. Audrey Nelson in August 1989. Guadalupe Apodaca in September 1989. None connected to each other. None connected to him. Each case went cold on its own, and the van kept moving through those streets. Here is the fact that sits at the center of this case and does not move no matter how long you look at it. He was not a ghost. He was a 6'3", 200-pound man with a criminal record stretching back to 1956, with more than 100 arrests across 11 states, with a recent violent conviction from San Diego for nearly killing 2 women with his bare hands, a conviction that had put him in prison for 2.5 years and released him just 5 months before Carol Alford died in that alley. His name was in the system. His fingerprints were in the system. He had been processed by law enforcement more times than most people are processed in several lifetimes. But the cases were scattered across too many jurisdictions. No single agency had reason to see the whole shape. And the women he was targeting, women from South Los Angeles navigating addiction and street economies, women whose deaths were being processed quickly and sometimes incorrectly, were not generating the kind of sustained institutional pressure that forces pieces together. After Los Angeles, he kept moving. His long-term companion, Aurelia Dorsey, a woman who had traveled with him for years and supported them both through shoplifting, died of a brain hemorrhage in Los Angeles in 1988. He continued alone, through the South, through the Midwest, arrested repeatedly on minor charges, processed and released, his name cycling through databases across the country attached to something far smaller than the truth of what he was. His last victim was a woman found strangled in a Walmart parking lot in Tupelo, Mississippi in 2005. He had been killing for 35 years. Then he stopped, drifted, aged. In September 2012, police in Louisville, Kentucky found him at the Wayside Christian Mission homeless shelter on an outstanding narcotics warrant from California. He was arrested, extradited, processed, exactly like every other time his name had moved through the system. But this time something was waiting for him in California that had not existed in 1987. The DNA collected from beneath Audrey Nelson's fingernails on August 14, 1989. Those clippings taken by officers who were simply doing their job carefully on a Tuesday morning behind a nightclub on East 7th Street had been sitting in a cold case file for 23 years. When investigators ran it against the National DNA Database, they got a match. They ran it against Carol Alford's case. Match. They ran it against Guadalupe Apodaca. Match. 3 cases. 1 man. 23 years of silence. And a match that should have arrived decades earlier. The trial came in September 2014. He was 74 years old, wheelchair-bound, barely recognizable as the man who had driven his van through the streets of South Los Angeles in the summer of 1987. He screamed his innocence from the defense table as witness after witness. Women who had survived encounters with him in cities across the country testified about what he had done to them. He called the entire proceeding a legal lynching. He punched his fist in the air as he was wheeled out of the courtroom. The jury had deliberated for 2 hours. 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Then a Texas Ranger named James Holland walked into his prison cell. Holland had been sent to investigate a single cold case, the 1994 murder of a woman named Denise Brothers, found strangled in a parking lot in Odessa, Texas. He sat down across from the old man in the wheelchair and did not confront him, did not accuse him. He listened. He asked questions the way someone asks questions when they are genuinely curious. He made the old man feel, for the first time in years, like the most interesting person in the room. Over 49 days, eventually stretching to more than 700 hours of recorded conversation, the old man talked. He did not just confess to Denise Brothers. He confessed to everything, decades of everything. He named cities. He described women with a specificity that made the investigators sitting across from him go very still. Their faces, their clothing, the exact street corners where he had approached them, the particular circumstances of each encounter. He reached for a pencil and began drawing portraits from memory. Detailed, careful drawings of women he had encountered in some cases 40 years earlier. Investigators took those drawings to police departments across the country and held them up against photographs in cold case files that had not been opened in decades. The matches came back one after another. He said he had killed 93 people. When a detective asked how he had gone undetected for so long, he leaned back and said, "Sometimes they just walk right into my little spider web." The FBI cross-referenced every confession against cold case records across 19 states. When they went back through the original files from the cities and years he described, they found something that should have been impossible. A significant number of his victims had never been classified as homicide victims at all. Women recorded as overdoses, as undetermined causes, as natural causes, murders processed and closed without anyone understanding what had actually happened. Some had no file at all. In October 2019, the FBI made their announcement. His name was Samuel Little, born Samuel McDowell, June 7, 1940. Reynolds, Georgia, the most prolific confirmed serial killer in the history of the United States. More verified victims than any other documented offender in the country's criminal record. The FBI confirmed his involvement in at least 60 murders and considered all 93 credible. Samuel Little died in a Los Angeles hospital on December 30th, 2020. He was 80 years old. Carol Alford, Audrey Nelson, Guadalupe Apodaca. 3 women found in the streets surrounding Skid Row in the late 1980s. And dozens more across 19 states. Some identified, some still listed only as Jane Doe, some with nothing left in the record to mark that they ever existed at all. Samuel Little drifted into Los Angeles from the outside. A man who arrived in a van, spent a few years hunting in the streets surrounding Skid Row, and moved on before anyone understood what he had been doing. The man in this next case never had a drift anywhere. He was already home. He was born on August 30th, 1952, and grew up in the same South Los Angeles neighborhoods where he would one day hunt for victims. He went to school there. He got married there. He had 2 children there. He worked for the city of Los Angeles as a sanitation worker, a job that made him intimately familiar with the alleyways, the dumpsters, the dead zones between patrol routes where a body could go undiscovered for days. He fixed neighbors' cars in his front yard on weekends and chatted with passersby while he worked. People who lived near him described him as friendly, helpful, the kind of man you did not think twice about. He had a house on West 81st Street in South Los Angeles. He lived there for decades. And from the mid-1980s onward, he was doing something inside that ordinary life that would eventually produce one of the most disturbing discoveries in Los Angeles history. On the morning of August 10th, 1985, a 29-year-old woman named Deborah Jackson was found shot 3 times in the chest and dumped in a garbage-filled alley in South Los Angeles. She had been a cocktail waitress. She had left a friend's apartment and was walking to a bus stop when she disappeared. Her body was found the following morning, half hidden in the kind of alley that the city had long since stopped paying much attention to. She was the first. Over the next 3 years, 8 more women would be found in alleys and dumpsters across the same neighborhood. Shot, strangled, disposed of in the same casual, contemptuous way. And through all of it, on West 81st Street, a man with grease on his hand from fixing a neighbor's transmission went inside at the end of the day, sat down at his kitchen table, and ate dinner with his family. Nobody suspected him of anything, and that silence would last for 25 years. South Los Angeles in 1985 was not Skid Row, not exactly. Where Skid Row was a corridor of transient poverty, a place people washed up in and drifted through, South LA was a residential community with deep roots. People were born there, raised families there, built lives across generations. Block associations, churches on every corner, corner stores where the same families have been shopping for 30 years. It had the specific layered texture of a place where people genuinely lived rather than merely survived. But in 1985, it was also a community under siege. The crack cocaine epidemic was burning through South Los Angeles with a speed and ferocity that nothing in the city's public health infrastructure was equipped to absorb. Families that had held together through previous hardships were fracturing. Women caught in addiction were losing the support systems that might otherwise have protected them. Family relationships strained, community ties loosened, daily life pushed into circumstances of increasing danger on streets that were becoming more unpredictable by the month. And the LAPD in that era, in that community, with those victims was not responding the way it should have been. The women disappearing from South LA streets were black women, many of them dealing with addiction. Cases were opened, minimally. Reports were filed, sometimes. But the sustained investigative pressure, the resources, the follow-through, the institutional urgency that turns an open homicide into a solved one was largely absent. The response was so inadequate that in 1989 a group of community members formed the Black Coalition Fighting Back Serial Murders specifically to protest the LAPD's indifference. Their concerns were largely ignored. The LAPD knew, by the mid-1980s, that a serial offender was targeting black women in South Los Angeles. They kept that information from the public. They kept it from the families of victims. They kept it from the women still living on those streets who had no idea the danger they were in. Someone in that neighborhood noticed the absence of urgency. Noticed it the way a predator notices, quietly, patiently, with the specific attention of someone calculating what the lack of scrutiny makes possible. He had been living there his whole life. He understood the geography better than anyone. He knew which alleys went unwatched. He knew which hours of the night were darkest on which specific blocks. He had driven a garbage truck through those streets for years. In the summer of 1985, he started using that knowledge. August 10th, 1985, Deborah Jackson, 29 years old, shot 3 times in the chest, found in an alley. Just over a year later, Henrietta Wright, 35 years old, was found a few miles away. Shot, sexually assaulted, dumped in the same kind of garbage-filled alley that the city had learned not to look at too closely. August 14th, 1986, Thomas Steele, 36, the one anomaly, a man who had been visiting family from San Diego, found in the middle of an intersection. January 10th, 1987, Barbara Ware, 23 years old. April 15th, 1987, Bernita Sparks, 26. October 1987, Mary Lowe, 26. January 1988, Lacrica Jefferson, 22 years old, found in an alley in South Los Angeles. Each case was opened. Each went cold. The LAPD was simultaneously dealing with a cluster of similar murders in the same area that investigators had attributed to a single unknown offender they called the South Side Slayer, not understanding yet that multiple men were operating in the same corridor simultaneously. The cases piled on top of each other in a system already overwhelmed, and the thread connecting them to the man on West 81st Street remained invisible. Then came November 19th, 1988. A 27-year-old mother of 2, named Anitra Washington, was walking a familiar route to a friend's house when a man in an orange Ford Pinto pulled up alongside her. He was friendly. He seemed harmless. She got in. He shot her in the chest before she could react. Then he took out a Polaroid camera and photographed her while she was wounded and barely conscious. Then he drove to an alley in South Los Angeles and dumped her from the moving car. Anitra Washington survived. She crawled to help. She gave investigators a description so precise and detailed. The car, the man, the Polaroid camera, the specific way he had spoken to her, that it should have broken the case wide open. It did not. No arrest was made. But something else happened. After Anitra Washington survived and gave her description, the killing stopped. Completely. No more bodies. No more pattern. Just silence. The silence lasted 14 years. During those 14 years, the man on West 81st Street kept living his life. He worked his sanitation job. He fixed neighbors' cars on weekends. He got up every morning, had breakfast, went about his day. The families of Deborah Jackson and Henrietta Wright and Barbara Ware and Lacrica Jefferson and all the others had no answers. The cases sat in cold storage. The community that had formed the Black Coalition fighting back serial murders watched the years pass without resolution. Then in March 2002, the body of a 15-year-old girl named Princess Bertha Muir was found strangled in a South Los Angeles alley. She had run away from a foster home 3 months earlier. Her sister Samara described her as one of the sweetest, gentlest souls she had ever known. July 2003, Valerie McCorvey, 35 years old, found strangled and dumped in an alley. January 1st, 2007, Janicia Peters, 25 years old, was found nude and stuffed inside a garbage bag in a deserted alleyway in South Los Angeles. She had been shot with a .25 caliber handgun, the same weapon signature from the late 1980s cases. The DNA collected from Janicia's body matched DNA from 7 of the 1980s cold case files. The Grim Sleeper, a name coined by journalist Christine Pelisek of LA Weekly in 2008 after she broke a story the LAPD had been quietly sitting on for months, had not stopped. He had paused, or appeared to have paused, and then returned as if the 14 years between had meant nothing at all. A task force was finally formed in 2007, 22 years after Deborah Jackson's body was found in that alley. The DNA evidence was solid. The pattern was undeniable. But the profile in the database matched no one. For 3 more years, investigators worked the case without a name. Until in 2009, a young man named Christopher Franklin was arrested on a weapons charge, and his DNA entered the system. The partial match pointed to a biological relative. Investigators began following Christopher's father. They tracked him to a birthday party at a restaurant in South Los Angeles. An undercover officer working the room collected his discarded pizza crust, his plate, his silverware. The DNA from that pizza crust matched the DNA from the bodies of 10 women. On July 7, 2010, LAPD officers surrounded a house on West 81st Street in South Los Angeles at 9:20 in the morning. A 57-year-old man was standing outside his own front door when they arrested him. His name was Lonnie David Franklin Jr., born August 30th, 1952, lifelong resident of South Central Los Angeles. Former United States Army soldier, given a dishonorable discharge in 1975 after being convicted by a West German court of kidnapping and gang raping a 17-year-old girl in Stuttgart while stationed there in 1974. The soldiers had taken photographs of the attack. Franklin would repeat that behavior with every victim he encountered in Los Angeles over the following decades. When investigators searched his house on West 81st Street, they were not prepared for what they found. Over 1,000 photographs of women, hundreds of hours of video recordings, images of women in every state, some appearing unconscious, some clearly unaware they were being photographed. Some in situations that told investigators immediately that the 10 confirmed victims were almost certainly not the full picture. Police Chief Charlie Beck stood at a press conference and said, "We certainly don't believe we are so lucky or so good as to know all of his victims." The LAPD released many of the photographs publicly, asking the community to help identify the women depicted. Some are recognized. Others have never been identified to this day. They also found the .25 caliber pistol used in multiple murders. The trial began in February 2016. Franklin sat through 2 months of proceedings in near total silence. His attorney challenged the DNA evidence, argued misidentification, questioned the reliability of familial testing. The jury spent less than a week deliberating. On May 5, 2016, the jury convicted Lonnie David Franklin Jr. on 10 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. On August 10, 2016, he was sentenced to death. Lonnie David Franklin Jr. died in his cell at San Quentin State Prison on March 28, 2020. He was 67 years old. The cause of death, heart problems and high blood pressure, was confirmed by the Marin County Coroner's office. He took everything else he knew with him. Deborah Jackson, Henrietta Wright, Baba Vava, Bernita Sparks, Mary Lowe, Lacrica Jefferson, Alicia Alexander, Princess Bertha Muir, 15 years old, Valerie McCorvey, Janicia Peters, and somewhere inside those 1,000 photographs women whose names we still do not know. The Grim Sleeper lived among his victims his entire life. He drove his garbage truck down their streets. He waved to their neighbors. He fixed their cars. He knew exactly how little the city around them would do when they disappeared. He was right for 25 years. Lonnie David Franklin Jr. lived among his victims his entire life, on the same streets in the same neighborhood, fixing cars in the same driveway, while the families of the women he had killed moved through the same corridor without ever knowing what had happened or why. The man in this next case was even harder to see coming. He was not a homeowner with a stable address. He was not a city employee with a predictable schedule. He was a drifter, someone who moved between homeless shelters and missions and flop houses along the same Figueroa Street corridor in South Los Angeles where he was hunting. He ate at the same missions as his victims. He slept in the same shelters. He stood in the same food lines, sat in the same plastic chairs, walked through the same metal detectors. And at some point, somebody at the midnight mission on Skid Row decided to give him a job as a security guard. He was supposed to be protecting the people who came through those doors. On the morning of March 9th, 1987, a 21-year-old woman named Diane Johnson was found face down and partially nude in a roadway construction area west of the Harbor Freeway in South Los Angeles. She had been strangled and left in the open like she meant nothing. Investigators processed the scene, collected evidence, opened a case. Then it went cold. He was already looking for the next one. Over the next 11 years, he moved through a 4-block-wide corridor running along Figueroa Street between Gage Avenue and 108th Street in South Los Angeles. And he strangled 13 more women. He was arrested 7 times during those 11 years for minor offenses. He was in and out of county jail repeatedly. He attended the funeral dinner of one of his pregnant victims and sat among her grieving family eating food they had prepared. Nobody suspected him of anything. Then in March 2002, a 47-year-old woman named Maria Martinez handed him a cigarette lighter on Skid Row. And everything changed. To understand how one man could strangle 14 women across 11 years in a 4-block corridor of South Los Angeles without a single murder charge, you have to understand what that corridor was between 1987 and 1998. He had been born in Warren, Arkansas. On November 5th, 1966, his parents separated when he was 5 years old, and his mother brought him to Los Angeles, to the neighborhood along Figueroa Street in South LA that would define the rest of his life. He attended Gompers Middle School, where classmates later recalled him grabbing girls and being nicknamed Chester the Molester. He attended Locke High School until he dropped out. He worked for Domino's Pizza as a cook and delivery driver, a job that gave him a van, gave him mobility, gave him an intimate familiarity with the alleyways and back streets of South Los Angeles that he would use for years in ways nobody at Domino's could have imagined. When his mother moved to Utah, he drifted between homeless shelters, between missions, between the midnight mission on Skid Row and the various flop houses scattered along the Figueroa Street corridor. He fathered 4 children with different women during this period, some of whom were eventually raised by his mother after his arrest. He was described by neighbors and acquaintances as quiet, unassuming, a man who fit so seamlessly into the landscape of the corridor that he drew no particular attention. The crack cocaine epidemic had pushed vulnerability in South Los Angeles to its sharpest edge by the late 1980s. Women navigating addiction were taking risks to survive that the circumstances of their lives had made unavoidable. The corridor along Figueroa Street had become one of the most dangerous stretches for vulnerable women in all of Los Angeles. And when those women began dying, found in alleys, behind vacant buildings, in construction areas alongside the freeway, the LAPD's response was not what it should have been. The cases were assigned to already overloaded detectives. They were processed and moved along. The victim profile, black women from South Los Angeles, many dealing with addiction, did not generate the kind of institutional urgency that forces a department to look harder and longer and deeper than the immediate evidence suggests that he understood that. He had grown up in that corridor. He had watched those streets his entire life. He knew exactly what the system paid attention to and what it did not. He used that knowledge every time. March 9th, 1987. Diane Johnson, 21 years old. Found partially nude alongside the Harbor Freeway. Strangled. June 1987. Alandra Bunn, 34. Found nude in a pile of trash in an alley. October 1987. Annette Ernest, 26. Found partially clothed on a road shoulder. January 1989. Anita Fishman, 31. Found strangled outside a garage in an alley off Figueroa Street. September 23rd, 1989. And this is the one that stays with you. Regina Nadine Washington was 27 years old. She was 6 months pregnant. Her body was found strangled inside a detached garage behind a vacant home in South Los Angeles. Her mother, Jerry Johnson, later told reporters that she had been 5.5 months pregnant and that her daughter, Andrea... Wait, that was another victim. Jerry Johnson's daughter was Andrea Triplett. Regina Washington's family received no public statement at all. She and the child she was carrying were simply gone. The killings continued through the early 1990s. November 1992. Deborah Williams, 32. December 1992. Mary Edwards, 41. April 1993. Andrea Triplett, 29, 5.5 months pregnant. Found behind a vacant building on Figueroa Street. Her mother, Jerry Johnson, later said on national radio that she had learned about her daughter's death from a stranger on the street. In 1993, Desiree Jones, 29. Her brother Frank described her as smart, outgoing, funny, a woman who had worked at a rest home for the elderly before addiction took hold. Through all of it, he was cycling in and out of jail. Jailed from 1987 to 1989. Released. Jailed again 1989 to 1992. Released. Jailed 1993 to 1995. Released. Every time the doors closed behind him, the killings stopped. Every time they opened, the killings resumed. The pattern was there, precise, undeniable, right there in the timeline for anyone with reason to look at the full picture. Nobody had reason to look at the full picture. February 3rd, 1998. Paula Vance, 41 years old. Strangled near a business in Azusa. 5 surveillance cameras captured portions of the attack. The killer visible in multiple frames as a dark shape. One camera had been positioned to film his face directly. Investigators who reviewed the footage later said the camera cut away seconds before he came into frame. Seconds. April 6th, 1998. Brenda Breeze, 37. Found strangled inside a portable toilet near Little Tokyo, 50 yards from the hotel where he was staying at the time. 50 yards. Then he fled to Utah, violated his parole. For 4 years, the killing stopped, until Maria Martinez handed him a lighter. March 2002. Skid Row, downtown Los Angeles. Maria Martinez was 47 years old, living on the street in the area surrounding the Midnight Mission homeless shelter. A man she recognized from the mission approached her and asked to borrow a cigarette lighter. She handed it to him. He grabbed her by the throat, dragged her behind a dumpster, and held her there for approximately 2 hours. Before he walked away, he told her he would kill her if she went to the police. She went to the police. She went first to Central Division Station on 6th Street. The officers there did not take a report. She left, went back to the street, thought about it overnight. The next morning, she walked to the Midnight Mission, told a staff member what had happened, and that woman sat with her and convinced her to try again. She went to a second station. This time they listened. An assault kit was collected. She identified her attacker by name. She knew him from the mission. He was arrested within days and charged with rape. He pled no contest. He was sentenced to 8 years in state prison. Standard procedure required him to submit a DNA sample to California's Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, as a condition of his incarceration. Investigators from the LAPD's Robbery Homicide Cold Case Unit had been quietly working a cluster of unsolved South Los Angeles strangulations for months. In September 2003, a detective ran the DNA from one cold case through CODIS and got a match to the man, now sitting in a California prison for raping Maria Martinez. The detective ran another cold case. Match. Then another after that. Case after case after case came back to one man. His name was Chester Dwayne Turner. Born November 5th, 1966. Former Domino's Pizza delivery driver. Security guard at the Midnight Mission homeless shelter on Skid Row. A quiet, unassuming man who had been known in the neighborhood his entire life and had fit so seamlessly into the landscape of that corridor that the police had spent years looking for entirely different suspects. He was 6'2" and 260 pounds with a long scar running from the right side of his shaved head down the side of his face. People who encountered him in custody described his eyes as cold and empty in the specific way that made interviews with him deeply uncomfortable. The LAPD announced his arrest in October 2004. The trial opened in early 2007. Deputy District Attorney Bobby Grace stood in front of the jury and told them that the evidence would show Chester Turner was possibly the most prolific serial killer in the history of the city of Los Angeles. He told them Turner had attended the funeral dinner of one of his pregnant victims, sat among her grieving family, ate the food they had prepared, said nothing. The jury convicted him on April 30th, 2007 on 10 counts of first-degree murder. On July 10th, 2007, he was sentenced to death. In 2014, DNA connected him to 4 additional murders, and he received a second death sentence. But the detail that makes this case impossible to process cleanly is not Chester Turner. It is David Allen Jones. Jones was a 28-year-old mentally disabled part-time janitor who had been questioned without an attorney in 1993 and had made statements placing himself near some of the victims. He was convicted in 1995 of 3 murders that Chester Turner had committed. He was sentenced to 36 years to life. He served 11 years in a California prison for murders committed by a man who, during those same 11 years, was still free and still killing. When Turner's DNA matched those 3 cases, Jones was released in March 2004. He filed a lawsuit against the city of Los Angeles. Chester Turner currently sits on death row. Diane Johnson, Elandra Bunn, Annette Ernest, Anita Fishman, Regina Nadine Washington, 6 months pregnant, Deborah Williams, Mary Edwards, Andrea Triplett, 5.5 months pregnant, Desiree Jones, Natalie Price, Mildred Beasley, Cynthia Johnson, Paula Vance, Brenda Breeze. 14 women across 11 years. Found in alleys and garages and construction sites and portable toilets along a 4-block corridor in South Los Angeles. Left by a man who had grown up on those streets, eaten in those missions, slept in those shelters, and understood with absolute precision how little the system around him would do when women like these went missing. Maria Martinez handed Chester Turner a cigarette lighter and refused to stay silent. Because of that single act of courage, going back when the first officers turned her away, going back again the next morning, 14 cold case files found their match, and an innocent man walked out of prison. She never knew any of that when she knocked on that second precinct door. She just decided her life mattered enough to say something. She was right. How many people had moved through these 50 blocks, through the missions and the shelters and the alleyways and the tent cities of Skid Row, doing things to the most vulnerable people in Los Angeles, while the city around them maintained the same comfortable distance it had always maintained? By 2019, the corridor had changed in ways that were visible and real. There were cameras now at intersections that had once been completely dark. There were outreach workers who knew residents by name and noticed when familiar faces stopped appearing. There were advocacy organizations that had spent decades building genuine relationships on those streets. Organizations that could get someone on the phone at the Los Angeles Times in under an hour if something happened that the city needed to hear about. And yet on any given night in August 2019, approximately 8,000 people were still sleeping in those 50 blocks. Still intense. Still in the specific exposed circumstances that the street creates for people with nowhere else to go. Still vulnerable in all the ways that mattered. On the night of August 26th, 2019, at approximately 11:30 in the evening, a man was seen near a tent at the corner of 6th and San Pedro Streets on Skid Row. The tent caught fire. Inside that tent was a 62-year-old man named Darrell Fields. His friends called him Hendrix. Before Skid Row, before the tent at 6th and San Pedro, He had played guitar with the Isley Brothers. He had played with Sly and the Family Stone. He was the kind of musician that other musicians talked about in the specific, quiet way reserved for people with something genuinely rare in them. What happened to him on that Monday night in August is the final case of the Skid Row dark side. To understand what Skid Row was on the night of August 26, 2019, you need to understand what the summer of 2019 had already been. It had been a brutal summer, even by the standards of a place defined by hardship. In the weeks before Darrell Fields died, a 59-year-old resident had been struck in the head with a metal pipe and robbed on 5th Street, left for dead on a sidewalk in broad daylight. A separate group of men had been arrested for setting fire to a homeless encampment in Eagle Rock, in San Julian Park, for people had been wounded in a shooting. The Los Angeles Times had run a series of stories about a wave of violence targeting unhoused people across the city, not just on Skid Row, but in neighborhoods throughout Los Angeles, that had been accelerating for months. The people living on those streets were aware of all of it. They talked about it in the shelters and at the outreach worker check-ins, and in the quiet hours between midnight and dawn when the blocks were at their stillest. A specific kind of vigilance had settled over the community. The heightened awareness of people who understand that the world around them has decided their safety is negotiable. Darrell Fields knew those streets the way you only know a place when you have lived in it for years. He had been a longtime resident of Skid Row, not a recent arrival, not someone passing through, but someone who had become part of the community's fabric. His wife Valerie was there. His 3 sisters knew where to find him. The Los Angeles Community Action Network, the advocacy organization that had been working on those streets for years, knew him by name and by reputation. They described him as someone working on numerous projects to elevate the healing power of arts and culture in Skid Row. Before all of it, before the tent at 6th and San Pedro, before the years on the row, he had been something else entirely. He had been a musician at a level that most people who pick up a guitar spend their entire life chasing without ever getting close. He had stood on stages with the Isley Brothers. He had played alongside Sly Stone. He had been in those rooms, made that music, inhabited a world of extraordinary creative achievement. At 62, he was living in a tent on Skid Row and still working, still playing, still trying to use what he had to do something meaningful for the people around him. That was who was inside that tent on the night of August 26th. August 26th, 2019. A Monday, 11:30 in the evening. The intersection of 6th and San Pedro Streets sits in the heart of Skid Row, one of the most densely populated corners in the entire corridor, surrounded on all sides by tents and cardboard shelters and people trying to get through the night. It is not a remote location. It is not somewhere a person can act without being seen. On any given evening in late August, hundreds of people are within a reasonable distance of that corner. A tent at that intersection caught fire. Darrell Fields was asleep inside it. What happened in the seconds after the fire started, the exact sequence of how a sleeping man processed the heat and the smoke and the specific horror of waking up inside a burning structure, is something only he knew and he did not survive to fully describe. What officers arriving at the scene found was the result. A man on fire, walking, moving down the middle of the street with the flames still on him, with nowhere to go, until officers reached him and were able to extinguish what was burning. He was 62 years old, and he had played with Sly and the Family Stone, and he was walking down a street in Los Angeles on fire. Paramedics arrived. He was taken to a hospital. His burns were severe, the kind of injuries that speak to how completely and quickly the fire had taken hold before he was able to get out. He was alive through the night. He was conscious enough at points to speak with hospital staff. On the morning of August 27th, Darrell Fields died. Officers working the scene that night had not needed to search far for a suspect. A 38-year-old man had been seen in the immediate area near the tent at the time of the fire. He had not gotten far before officers located him on the same block, still near the corner of 6th and San Pedro, and took him into custody. 2 days later, the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office filed charges. Capital murder, with a special circumstance allegation of murder involving the infliction of torture. His name was Jonathan Early. He was 38 years old. A law enforcement source described him as a transient, Someone who, like Darrell Fields, had been living on or around Skid Row. Not a stranger arriving from outside. Not someone who had driven in from another part of the city. Someone from the same corridor, from the same community, from the same 50 blocks. On September 25th, 2019, Jonathan Early stood in a downtown Los Angeles courtroom and pleaded not guilty to one count of capital murder. The charge included the special circumstance allegation of murder involving the infliction of torture, a designation under California law that requires prosecutors to establish that the defendant intentionally inflicted extreme pain and suffering for the purpose of revenge, extortion, or any sadistic reason. It is a charge that, if proven, makes the defendant eligible for the death penalty. Prosecutors had not yet decided whether to pursue that sentence. The LAPD's Robbery Homicide Division and the Los Angeles Fire Department's Arson and Counterterrorism Section were both investigating. The investigation into motive, into why, specifically, Jonathan Early had allegedly approached Darrell Fields' tent on a Monday night in late August and set it on fire, had not produced a publicly documented answer. No prior relationship between Early and Fields was established in the reporting. No good events. No connection that anyone who knew either man could identify or explain. Just a tent, a fire, and a man who had played with Sly Stone dying in a hospital the following morning. The case moved into the California court system where, as of available public records, proceedings have continued without a confirmed final verdict being publicly documented. The investigation and legal process that followed Jonathan Early's arrest remains, in the public record, unresolved. That absence, the lack of a clean courtroom ending, the absence of a verdict to point to, sits uncomfortably at the center of this final case. But it does not change what happened to Darrell Fields on the night of August 26, 2019. His wife's name was Valerie. She was still there at the corner of 6th and San Pedro on the days after he died, standing near where his tent had been, speaking to anyone who would listen about who her husband was. She said he was a great guy who would give you the shirt off his back. His 3 sisters knew where to find him. His community on Skid Row knew his music, had heard him play, had watched him work, had understood in the specific way that communities understand their own people that Darrell Fields was someone worth knowing. On the evening of August 28th, 2 days after the fire, the Los Angeles Community Action Network held a vigil. They gathered at 838 East 6th Street, near where he had lived, near where he had died, and they walked in a procession through the neighborhood carrying musical instruments. They were encouraged to wear purple. Pete White of LA stood in front of the gathered crowd and said, "This violence is misplaced in Skid Row. There is something in the air right now that we are hoping to disrupt this evening." Before Skid Row, Darrell Fields had played with the Isley Brothers. He had played with Sly and the Family Stone. He had been part of 2 of the most significant musical catalogs in American history. And then life had moved in the direction that it moved, the way it moves for people whose circumstances shift beneath them in ways they cannot always control. And he had ended up in a tent at the corner of 6th and San Pedro Streets in downtown Los Angeles. And he was still working, still playing, still trying to use what he had. That is the human reality underneath the case number and the capital murder filing and the special circumstance allegation of torture. Most people drive past Skid Row without stopping. They see the tents, the cardboard, the exhausted faces, and they keep moving. Windows up, eyes forward. But most people never consider this. The overwhelming majority of people living on those streets do not want to be there. Life moved in directions they could not always control. Job loss, illness, addiction, mental health struggles that went untreated for too long. Ordinary things that compounded over time until there was nowhere left to land. And once you're on those streets, getting back off them is harder than most people on the outside can imagine. Housing applications require an address. Jobs require a phone. Recovery requires stability. And stability requires all the things that are hardest to hold on to when you have nothing. So people get stuck. Not because they stop trying, but because the gap between where they are and where they need to be is wider than anyone should have to cross alone. Every person on those streets has a name, a history, people who loved them once upon a time, and a life they're still fighting for. They deserve to be seen as exactly that, If this video meant something to you, share it. Subscribe if you're new here. See you in the next one.